or suddenly this person is just in every piece of your world, getting several text messages, and it feels like romance. We're falling in love. I've met my soulmate. What I did know was that I was starting to walk on eggshells. There was absolutely no telling what would set him off, and it would always be my fault. Maybe about 10 minutes later, he came back in livid. He was furious because his video wouldn't upload. And he had determined that the reason his video would not upload was because I had asked him to search for something on the internet. As a result, his punishment was silent treatment, and I had to have him hold the baby, and he held the baby on the end of his knee, and the baby started to cry. And he was busy glaring at me the entire time, that my hands shaking. There was a point where she said to me, she said, I know you have all this evidence against him, which it was. I had all this evidence. And she said, but the thing of it is, I'll never forget this. She said, the thing of it is that I went on the home visit and I saw him with his son. And I have never in my life seen a father more loving towards their child.
Oh my God.
And I was just looking at her. This is what people go through when there's a covert narcissist at work. I was finding reasons for his behavior, right? Oh, well, he's going through a rough patch. I certainly can't just dump him because of this. I can't break up because of that. And it might be easy to anyone who hasn't been through it to be able to say, well, actually, you know, some of the things that you've been through, yeah, you should have left him. That's not how it works.
That's not how it works, yeah.
No.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our podcast, Life as a Seed podcast. On today's episode, I have another fantastic guest. Her name is Renee Rodriguez. Welcome, Renee.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patricia. It's great to be here.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, a bit about Renee. Renee is a custody consultant, a certified DV advocate, and divorce mediator. She helps protective mothers in custody battle against their narcissistic exes. She's going to be sharing all of her experiences as well with us. So welcome, Renee, to the podcast. Nice to have you.
Thank you. Again, it's good to be here.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
So let's jump right into it. So Renee, can you start by telling us about yourself, your background, what was growing up like, and what was your experience, with DV, and what led you into this path of being a DV advocate and fighting for women?
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
I think it's, I grew up, my childhood was spent in the Midwest, in the Midwestern United States. And so that was it felt like an idyllic childhood, and at a certain point we ended up moving to California because where we were, there were the steel mills, which at that time they were suddenly falling apart, the industry was gone. And so we started a new life in California, and I feel like that was really the start of my life. I ended up really loving California. I went to college there, really started who I am there, to be honest with you. And there came a point where I was traveling a lot, right? I had this career where I was traveling all over the place, and I ended up settling at a certain point in New York City. And when I was in New York, I had a career as a very high-level administrator working in strategy groups and strategy companies. And in New York, I was working for a company for quite a while where I just kept rising through the ranks, and life was good, right? It's like you pursue a career, you're really getting up there, you're advancing quickly. And at the same time, I even had sort of a side gig that I was doing that was doing well. Everything was going well. But there was a point where I felt like I wanted to move back to California, where that was a little more of who I was, more in my soul. But I ended up meeting somebody. And so I started a relationship with him. And it was one of those things where when I had been in California, it had been easy for me to date. When I moved to New York, it just wasn't. And so there was a part of me that felt very grateful to have met somebody and gotten to know somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere along the way, I began to not feel very good about myself. It's funny. I was listening to one of your episodes, an excellent episode back from August 13th in last year, 2024.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked to Mia.
Yes.
And Mia really describes perfectly what it was like. Right. It's, I think when Mia was talking, I felt like, yep, this is exactly it. This is what she's talking about. This is what I went through. And now that I do the work that I do, I can say this is what people pretty consistently go through when there's a covert narcissist at work. Right. So I had been working at a very high level. I was trusted with a lot of important projects. Plus, I was actually running a theater company that was just about to go off Broadway. Everything was at its peak in many ways.
Mm.
But then when I met him and I started integrating him into my life, things started to fall apart. My boss was suddenly no longer satisfied with work that before had been superior. I had a theater company with amazing company members, wonderful performers who suddenly started abandoning the company. I had, brought him into it and they were like, we can't work with this guy. And it's funny because it's not something, it's like you're identifying that something is wrong. You're identifying that you're not feeling good about yourself. But at the same time, as someone who is an empath, a lot of what I was doing was finding reasons for that, right? And it's, I think most people have heard the phrase throwing out the baby with the bathwater, where it's kind of like you can't just take something that's wrong and then just get rid of the whole thing.
Right.
And so I was finding reasons for his behavior, right? Oh, well, he's going through a rough patch. I certainly can't just dump him because of this. I can't break up because of that, right? And it might be easy to anyone who hasn't been through it to be able to say, well, actually, some of the things that you've been through, yeah, you should have left him. That's not how it works.
That's not how it works. Yeah.
No.
It's not the love bombing at the start, right? I'm sure he didn't start out with being
not at all
the way. Yeah.
Yeah. Nobody, like I remind my clients who feel so much guilt, and I have reminded myself of this quite a bit. Nobody dates a monster. Nobody dates an abuser, right? Nobody dates somebody who's cruel to them. That's not what people do. People don't go on second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth dates with somebody like that. And so it really is very much about them. It's, as you say, it's the love bombing where they're wonderful and they're affectionate. And when the mask does slip, they're very quick to come back and make things better and nicer and deepen, or so it seems, the relationship even more. And that's what I was experiencing, right? And I think it's really important to note that part of that, we talk about love bombing. That's where, they get you and they bring you in. And I think it's hard for most people to understand what love bombing truly looks like, right? There are red flags that we think of as romantic, that we watch these, movies with. I mean, one of my favorite stars is Sandra Bullock, and I love her. But it's definitely, those rom-coms really show something where, this person is suddenly there all the time and, you're waiting for their call and you're talking to them all night. And it turns out these things are red flags when you are, on the phone. Yeah, it's like there's no boundaries there. Suddenly this person is just in every piece of your world. Right. You're getting several emails and text messages from them at work, and it feels like romance. They're keeping you up all night just talking at the Starbucks. Romance. We're falling in love. I've met my soulmate. And I think one of the things about love bombing that isn't specifically talked about as much is that they seem to be on the same page with you about everything. Right? It's just they agree with you about this. This is their experience too. And they can speak to it so knowledgeably, so heartfully, that of course it's believable, because who does that except, a psychotic person?
Yeah.
Right? And people who have narcissistic personality disorder certainly have psychotic tendencies. But this is what we call romance. And the reality is that you have to be able to understand the difference between thoughtful, boundary-driven romance versus love bombing, right? If they have suddenly become the hugest part of your life and you realize that you are breathing their air, then you have to question, is this romance or is this love bombing? And I think one of the ways...
That's a good way to tell. Yeah. That's a good telltale sign.
And
all of a sudden your world, like they're now the center of your world, like everything about you is just them. Like you can't see anything beyond. They're just the whole epicenter of your world, and you're all, oh my God. Yeah.
And they're a part of everything, right? It's plans that you had with friends, suddenly they're coming. Even if it's a girls' night out, suddenly they're joining. And I think one of the tests, if any of us could ever go back, one of the tests would be to place some boundaries, some simple boundaries, and see what that reaction is, right? If there's some sort of an extreme reaction, either something that's punishing and like a complete withdrawal,
Yeah.
or if there is something where the love bombing gets worse and and there's a rationalization, why wouldn't you want to be with me? Did I do something wrong? And suddenly they're a victim. That doesn't feel good. It should be something more along the lines of, oh yeah, I get it. Do you want to get together next week or something, instead of every day, all day long? And so the love bombing is something that I think is reinforced in our cultures, in what we see, in what we come to expect. And it feels like you're falling in love.
Right. And like you said, it's the love bombing that makes it more difficult and complicated for people to leave those relationships, right? When the devaluation starts, when they start abusing and devaluing them, it's hard because you're always thinking of that wonderful, nice person who was kind to you, who was good to you. And you're like, no, but he's a good person. He's only going through a rough time, and it keeps people stuck in such toxic situations.
Well, and a lot of people say, you're dating a narcissist because they only talk about themselves on the date. And I'm not going to say that that's not true, but I would say it's also important when they're pumping you for information and it sounds like they're just getting to know you. I think one has to be, and I'm not trying to be bitter or anything like that, but I do think it's important for people to be thoughtful and careful about how much they're sharing, how much information they're giving, because it does turn into gaslighting. Right? Everything that they now know about you are the things that they turn against you. And that's another thing to note, but it doesn't feel like they're turning it against you. Right? So this is where it starts to become, once more and more red flags show up, you're already in, right? They're very affectionate. In between, when they're being cruel, they're being wonderful, but they're also tying you to themselves in such a way that it's very hard to extract yourself. There are people who a year in realize that their friends aren't calling them anymore. And when they think back, it's kind of like, oh, because I wasn't really calling them very much. I was spending time with, my partner. And it doesn't occur to them to think, why am I only spending time with my partner? Why am I only going to the movies with them, only going bowling with them, only going on trips with them? Why isn't there the freedom to be able to do that? And maybe there is. And so there's a question which becomes, if I start to take that freedom, if I start to spend time with people who are not him, what is that reaction? And that's something that I think people really need to look at. But that was my world. I didn't know that I was slowly being isolated. What I did know was that I was starting to walk on eggshells, right? There was absolutely no telling what would set him off. And it would always be my fault. When we're working with people, we're always looking, what type of narcissist do they have? And most narcissists do employ every different kinds of narcissism there is out there. But, mine was particularly isolating. I realized that when we were hanging out with friends, anything that went wrong was somehow my fault. There was a time when he came home and he slammed the door, and he was upset because he had lost a folder that had some important documents in it. And I tried to express sympathy, but he was livid with me. And the reason why was because he said, I know I lost the folder because I was thinking about something that you had said the other day, and then the folder was gone. And so it became my fault because of me, right? There was another time when he got off the bus and hit his shin on, and I'm nowhere near him. You have to understand, he hit his shin on the fire hydrant because of where the bus just pulled up that time. And he was livid with me because he was coming home to me. And so the blame was severe. There was nothing I could do right because it simply wasn't possible. And yet I was still trying to do as much as I could right, so that at least that would minimize the amount of blame that I would take. But I was constantly being blamed all day long for small things, for large things, whether I was standing next to him or whether I was in, a different neighborhood at the time. It didn't matter. Everything was becoming my fault. And that was the hell that I was living in.
Wow.
But at one point, I found out I was having a baby. And so I shared that news with him, and I will never forget the moment that I told him for as long as I live, because something in his eyes completely changed. And the facade that he had been wearing, I never saw that behind closed doors again. I saw it in public, of course, when he was with me. Everybody saw, the gentle, warm laughter and all of that. It was a living hell. And so I went through a pregnancy that was incredibly difficult, craving the times when he was in a good mood, which obviously the more we went outdoors, the more I would get the facade, because that's who we're all believe we're falling in love with, is
Yeah.
that person, right? So the good thing about going out and about was that that person was there. I no longer believed I was in love with him, but at least I could bear that person, right? At least that was somebody who out in public, for the most part, would be lovely. Yeah.
So he wasn't happy you were having a child with him, or what? What was his issue with that?
He was quite cruel. So the silent treatment is another type of narcissistic
Yes,
tactic.
that is, I hate the silent treatment. Like,
Yeah.
it is so crushing.
Yeah, it's made to erase you, to make you feel like you don't exist. You're not worth anything. You're not worth talking to. You're not worth looking at.
Yeah.
He chose to sleep on the living room floor. There's no mattress there. There's no rug. There's no, so at the same time that for 4 days, so at the same time that he was punishing me with the silent treatment, he was punishing me by forcing him somehow to sleep on, the living room floor. It was just insanity. And, he finally came around, and then, we kind of just went through the pregnancy, I want to say together, but it was mostly just me. And there was an interesting moment. At one point we were at home and I was reading to the baby, to my pregnant belly, and he stopped, and I was like in 6 months, maybe at that point, perhaps. And he was kind of like, sometimes I'd like to read to the baby too. He could have knocked me over with a feather, because this is somebody who couldn't be bothered with anything. What's interesting is that I had started to secretly see a therapist. And the reason I was seeing the therapist secretly was because he didn't believe in therapy. And I knew that I would be punished or persuaded out of it if I told him I was seeing somebody. So I was privately seeing a therapist, and I came to her to ask her, something's wrong with my relationship, and I just want to know, what do I need to do? How do I need to change myself to fix this? So I was really, really adopting the blame for everything, even with my own therapist. And so I was seeing her, and there was one point where she said to me, is he like rubbing your feet, rubbing your back, bringing you anything? So I was kind of like, no. And I thought it was a strange question, because I'd been so conditioned.
Yeah.
That I was all like, why would he do that? Why would he, is he propping you up with pillows? No. Why would he do that? Is he this? Is he that? No. I don't understand why you're asking me why. I don't, of course he's not doing these things. Of course. It had become conditioned. So I was going through this pregnancy alone. I really was. And the truth is, that was probably better. It would have been better had he not been there at all. But there he was. He also, since he didn't believe in doctors, it was very hard for me to even get a midwife. And I ended up with an amazing midwife. And he vetoed having a doula as well. He just refused to allow me to have a doula. But there were a couple times that I did go and see a gynecologist who I really loved her. She was great. She'd always been my gynecologist. And he managed to phase her out. Not that I minded that, to be honest with you. But the 2 times that I had appointments with her, one of them was to get that ultrasound picture. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. He just refused to come with me to see the gynecologist. And then once I started seeing the midwife, he would come with me to every single appointment. And there was a point where the midwife said to him, there's a couple of appointments I just do with the moms, if that's okay. And he said it was not, that he preferred to be there for every minute. And I got to tell you, I'm going to pause. I'm going to say it wasn't until after my son was born that my midwife got me privately and said, I was just trying to get you away from him for a minute, because he was so controlling and so abusive. She wanted to do a test at one point for me to, where you drink all this juice and they figure out whether or not you have gestational diabetes. And he wanted to provide the exact juice. He wanted to because he didn't like what she was providing. Everything was deeply, deeply, deeply controlled. And it was all, by the way, in the name of health. making the healthiest choices. There were several times that he proclaimed himself to be one of the healthiest people in the world, and that he was an expert. You have to understand, this is somebody who does not have any degrees in anything medical, anything nutritional, anything like that. But he had read some books and felt he was a guru in health. And I bought into all of it. I really did. The result of it, because my diet was so severely restricted in the name of health, the pictures of me when I was pregnant are a little frightening. It literally looks like, I know I'm Puerto Rican, but I got pretty fair skin. As you can see, it looks like a peach skeleton holding a huge beach ball.
Wow.
And I was skeletal. I was absolutely skeletal. But my baby was growing quite hugely in me. So it's basically any food that I could get, he was taking, thank goodness. But the pictures are really quite frightening. And, people were saying something. People were saying, you're very, very thin. Are you sure you're eating enough? And I would absolutely crow about how he was having me eat. The fact that we only eat fruit. That's all we eat. We have a little bit of lettuce. It was just unbelievable. And I jumped on board. I was excited about it at first. But then it had turned into, this was how I had to eat. And I recognized that I was hungry a lot. And I wouldn't be after I ate. And so I would tell him, yeah, see, I'm not hungry at all. Well, of course I'm hungry. I just ate. But it would be all of 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Hungry again. Right. So there came a point where a friend, I was having lunch with her and I said, what do you think I can do? This happened. What can I fix? What can I do? How can I change? And she said, Renee, I'm sick of you saying this. I was like, oh my God, is this friendship ending or something? And she said, the thing of it is that I think you're being mentally abused. I think you're suffering from mental abuse.
So sorry to cut you short, Renee. So before now, even we go into therapy, I know your therapist, mentioned, like you were telling her, you wanted to know how to fix yourself for the relationship. So before now, you never knew all you were going through was abuse. You didn't clock it as abuse. You thought it was just normal and part of life.
I didn't think it was normal. I thought that I was doing something wrong.
Okay. So your therapist she didn't have the whole picture and she didn't know you were, she didn't identify that for you?
Well, that's where it gets interesting, because the first thing I did after I left my friend was to call my therapist.
Okay.
And I said, do you think I'm being mentally abused? And she said, yes.
Wow.
And I said, my God, why didn't you tell me? And she says, because you can't tell people that they're being abused many, many times. And so what I did was I encouraged you each week to analyze his behavior and to use your voice with him. And that's why you kept coming in saying, I tried what you said and it didn't work, because I wanted you to see that normal conversation didn't work. I mean, he was all about, which many of these narcissists are, he would rationalize away whatever I would say. He would sound logical about what I was saying versus what he was saying. He would be the one who was being rational and logical, not me. And he would point that out, the gaslighting, right? The actual gaslighting, which I know is the popular term on TikTok. And there's a part of me that's very thankful for that. And then there's a part of me that worries about what we term gaslighting and what we don't. But severe gaslighting is something that destroys your thinking and it can take decades to recover from that. It can take decades. So I spent a couple of weeks scouring the internet to try to find what I could, but this was a while back. I know it's even as recently as, 12, 13 years ago. It's hard for people to believe that there weren't so many forums. There wasn't so much.
Yes.
Now there's so much volume.
Yes. Yeah. Thank God for that. Thank God.
Yes, right. There's more resources. There's more community out there, support for it. But I ended up, there was a night when I was laying beside my son, and my ex came into the room, and he had asked me about something. And I had said, hey, could you look something up while you're uploading that video that you need to upload for your job? And so he said, sure. And then maybe about 10 minutes later, he came back in livid. He was furious because his video wouldn't upload. And he had determined that the reason his video would not upload was because I had asked him to search for something on the internet. So a simple Google search had somehow, in his mind, upended the video, and all of that was also my fault. As a result, his punishment was that he wasn't making dinner. Well, I was breastfeeding, and I don't know if you've ever breastfed, but people always say you eat so much when you're pregnant. For me, I was starving. I was starving while I was breastfeeding. So I constantly had to eat, and he just wasn't making food. So I came out to try to make myself something, and I had to have him hold the baby, and he held the baby on the end of his knee, and the baby started to cry. And he was busy glaring at me the entire time, that my hands shaking as I held a knife. I was trying to make myself a salad. I was just trying to get myself some food, and my hands were just shaking. I don't know if it was from fear or hunger. I feel like it was more from fear, because not that it wasn't something I lived with, but it was the first time that I had seen him completely ignore our baby's distress in favor of making sure I understood how horrible a person I was for his video not uploading. So I made myself half a salad. I was just all kind of like, and so I grabbed the food, grabbed our baby, and went into the other room. And I texted the friend who had identified the mental abuse and said, "Are you available tomorrow? I think I need to leave."
Thank God.
Yeah.
Thank God.
Yeah.
I was waiting for that.
Yeah. She's all like, "I have to work. I'm calling off." She said, "I'm calling off of work." She came over the next day, and she helped him pack a couple bags. And here's what's so interesting is that I called the DV hotline, and I said, "Hey, here's the situation. What do I say to him when he comes home to let him know that we're leaving?" And so they started asking me questions. And a lot of what I was saying was, well, you have to understand, he's not hitting me. I have seen him be violent with others, but he's never been violent with me. And, he's never this. And he doesn't raise his voice, as a matter of fact. No, but they were finishing my sentences. I would say he would say this, and they were all kind of like, "You're suffering severe abuse." And so I said, "Oh, goodness. So what should I didn't believe I was being abused." And so it was interesting that I was calling the DV hotline. Some part of me was still driving me there, And so I said, "So what do I say?" And they said, "We think you should just flee, actually. We strongly advise you to simply go. Do you have a place to stay, etc." My friend was like, "Yeah, she's going to be with me." And we just, at that point, they scared the crap out of me. And so we just took what we had, which was, a suitcase and 2 big bags. There was a foot of snow outside. And, most of it was stuff for the baby. I'm a mom. And so I took it for myself, but everything I thought that my baby needed. And then I fled. After that, he sent me text messages saying, "Where are you?" And he was showing me pictures of a lot of my childhood stuff at home and saying, "Okay, threw that out. You better call me because this is next." And he was sending me pictures of all these precious mementos from my childhood and from my life that he knew were important to me. And he would send me picture after picture saying, "This is next. You've got this long to call me. You better call me because this is next. Okay, that's gone. This is next." And it was beyond, because he was so covert before, that to have him be overt like that was even more frightening, right? And that he was off the rails. So, fast forward, I ended up realizing, unlike, Mia from, your August episode, I did have a custody battle ahead. And it's an interesting
So
thing.
he wanted the child, even though he wasn't happy with the child being born. He still wanted custody over the child.
That's his property. That's his
Wow.
possession. And for some narcissists, it's also an extension of who they are, even if they can't be a child, right? And you also have to appreciate that whenever we were out of doors, I could barely get my hands on my child. The only time that he would let me have the baby was when the baby was crying for food. And so I had to solve that, right? Because I was breastfeeding. And so when we were in public, yes, I, had our child in a baby carrier, but when we were seeing his friends and that type of thing, yeah, he was taking care of
the baby. He was like best dad in the world,
in the world.
Oh, wow.
And so it was a rough time for all of us. And I ended up interviewing 13, which is a lucky number for me, 13 lawyers. And the reason that I finally went with that final lawyer is that he was the first person who heard my story and said, "We have to help you get control of your own life back." I was all like, oh my God. As soon as he said that, I was like, that's just it. I have no control over anything. I haven't had control over anything for a while. At the same
So,
time,
Renee, sorry to call you short because I've been just curious. So how long were you with him for? How many years did this relationship last?
2 years. That was it.
All of this happened in 2 years?
2 years. In
My
2 years, I want to pause. I want to say, I have such admiration for women who leave and women who stay,
Mm-hmm.
because when you talk to the women who stay, they're almost always saying, but I was the buffer for my children. I was the one who was taking most of the abuse. When there's psychological control like that, the mother really just gets in the way of that, even to a point where they will provoke, not, I mean, and I'm using the word provoke in the
Mm-hmm.
loosest possible way. If the children start to suffer from any of, this coercive control, this psychological abuse,
Yeah.
then, mothers will say something that they know will, excuse my language, but piss off their husband,
Mm-hmm.
their partner, because it doesn't take much. They're very thin-skinned in the
Yeah.
end. They're very, very thin-skinned. And so it's easy to get their attention and make them mad at you.
Than your kids.
And so, like I said, I've definitely been around plenty of moms who stayed for quite a long time until they couldn't stand it anymore. But of course, the work I do is with parents who are fighting for custody. And when I went through my custody battle, there comes a point where if a custody battle is going on long enough, there might be a custody evaluation. It might be called forensic evaluation. It might be called a psych evaluation, which can also be different things, but a custody evaluation can also be termed those things. And with the evaluation, I had realized I had a lawyer who I really loved, but now I have a strategy background. And yet I could tell that it wasn't enough. You think you get a lawyer and you go in and there you go. But I could tell the way everything was going that it wasn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so the research I was doing led me to Tina Swithin, the head of One Mom's Battle. And Tina at the time had just started doing some coaching. And so I was working with her and she said, Renee, now that you're going to this custody evaluation, you have to understand that is not something I'm well versed in. It's not something I'm particularly good at. There's a couple people who I think could help you. And she got back to me. She says, so I talked to those couple people. One of them isn't doing it anymore because she can't take the stories of abuse anymore. She just doesn't want it in her world. The other one is booked for months and months and months. And she said, but Renee, you have a strategy background. You're very good at this. Why don't you just put something together and then let's kind of work through it together? And I said, okay. So I went away and I just did my best guess at the clearest possible way I could to kind of show and evaluate what was going on. And then I met with Tina again and I showed her and she said, Renee, I've never seen anything like this. I've never in my life seen abuse laid out so clearly. She was like, you should be coaching. And to which I said, slow your roll, Tina. I still got to get through my own, battle here. But about a year and a half later, someone else who worked with Tina came and said, she is happily sharing your stuff and you should be doing this because you can speak to this much better than anybody. And you could probably even expand on this into, all of the custody pieces, not just the evaluation based on what we see here. So that's what I ended up doing. And my evaluation was a tough thing to go through. After it, I did end up with full custody.
Okay, good. I shouldn't be saying good though, because I feel like a child needs both parents. But in an event when the other parent is maybe abusive,
I know.
I think
You
it's
know what?
best. Yeah.
I love that you're saying that because that's something I had to grapple with myself.
Mm,
Before I met him, it had been, I was getting on in years, as they say, of women who are
yeah.
above 30. And so I had been starting an adoption process as a single mom. And, when I met him, I was so grateful that I didn't have to be a single mom. It wasn't really my top choice, which is something he tried to say in court. The only reason she wants is because she was always wanting to be a single mom. That wasn't true. It's just that I thought that was the only choice I had. But that is how I ended up, and that's fine. But if there's one thing I have since learned, it's that I'm gonna, we know from ACEs studies and we know from a lot of psychological studies that no, actually, if there's an abusive parent, that a child is better off with one, healthier parent than to have two parents and one of them is disordered, has a cluster B personality disorder, which narcissistic personality disorder falls into.
Right.
And so it's one of those things where, and this happens so much, especially with the moms I'm working with, where when the child even does spend what little time or whatever amount of time they have with that narcissistic parent, that the healthier parent, the mom, is basically helping that child regulate again for anywhere from hours to 2 or 3 days after
Wow.
this child has come back home from a weekend with an abusive father. Um, One of the things you have to understand is that the 14th Amendment makes it so that parents have a right to parent their children in the United States. And so as a result, and the United States really does influence the family courts everywhere. It really does. And so as a result, you hear these horror stories and people are like, well, it simply can't be true that the court would award any time to an abuser. So there must be something wrong with the mom. No, that's not it. It's that the law says that no matter how bad he is, he, whether the narcissist is a father or a mother, which is rare, but it does happen, that nope, they still have a legal right. They have more rights to parenting time than a child does to protection. And so that, unfortunately, is something that, we're always dealing with and grappling with.
I see. So the 14th Amendment makes it difficult for parents who want full custody of their children due to abusive partners to have that
It does.
custody. So how
It
did you navigate yours? How were you able to get that full custody?
Yeah. Well, I'm a strategist. That's how. And so I was able to quickly understand the family court system, which, for everybody is a slap in the face. As soon as you have one or two court dates, you're just all kind of like, whoa, this is not what I thought it was. But the way my mind works is I'm constantly assessing, right? You think I would be able to, I'll tell you what, I'm also very good at spotting narcissists now.
Of course.
Yeah, but I was constantly assessing the systems, right? And so I was able to kind of understand what is actually important to them versus what's important for my child versus what's important for me. And I was able to go into my evaluation and say, these are the issues. Now, the evaluator, this is still one of the most fascinating things. And I just want to mention it real quick because this happens to a lot of moms.
Mm-hmm.
My child was definitely suffering some of what's called parental alienation. He would come home and I'd hear things that had been said or that had been done, and it was clear that there was a little bit of erasure attempts happening about my culture, and other things. The way I fed him, because I was feeding him actual cooked food and stuff like that, and so my son was trying to be turned against all of those things and who I was. I was even termed as being bad and causing poisons and toxins. So my child is hearing these things, right? And so my ex was practicing parental alienation, but the evaluator determined that I was the alienator. And this happens a lot to moms where they are. The funny thing is as knowledgeable and as strategic as I was, I had never said a single bad word against my ex. And so it was particularly shocking. But she put in the report that there was a danger of me alienating our child against my ex. And I was astounded when I read that.
Oh my God. Can you imagine?
Yeah, there was a point where she said to me, she said, I know you have all this evidence against him, which it was. I had all this evidence. And she said, but the thing of it is, I'll never forget this. She said, the thing of it is that I went on the home visit and I saw him with his son. And I have never in my life seen a father more loving towards their child.
Oh my God.
And I was just looking at her and I remember, because it was my first rodeo. And so I was just looking at her like, I couldn't understand, like I literally, I realized my mouth was actually open.
The trauma he is.
I just could not believe it. I was like, wow, you're supposed to be an expert. And that was such a huge clue to me. And I was glad I went in strategically, but I still needed to learn that just because they are an expert, it doesn't actually mean that they have any expertise in abuse, especially if there aren't bruises and broken bones sending you to the hospital. If you're not bleeding and broken, then there are an awful lot of people I now know from almost a decade in this work in the family court system who do not consider it abuse. They'll consider it marital discord or two parents arguing, but they cannot see abuse. Even now, even in this age of TikTok talking about gaslighting and that type of thing, it's very, very, there's also legislation on this, on coercive control, but it gives moms hope. And, in every state, every province, like everywhere that we work, The coercive control is something that's very difficult, especially in the United States, to actually use in court, to actually show in court. We're far more successful with it in Canada and Australia when we work there than we are in any place in the United States. Even Washington State, where the first coercive control law was passed, that's really actually a difficult state to convince them of coercive control, in spite of them being the first to have that kind of legislation. So it's a fascinating thing. But the way that I ended up with, and when I say full custody, that needs to be defined because of, the laws, which is to say that basically I have the far majority of the time. And so, I'm the primary resident and
Okay.
final decision maker. Yeah.
I see.
Things that are very, very difficult to achieve in court. And I think it works so much better for our child. And I think it works better for every child, because I think what most moms come up against is a 50-50 presumption.
Mm-hmm.
There's a story, right, in the Bible of, the baby brought before Solomon, and I'm the mom. No, I'm the mom. And it's kind of like, oh, well, I can solve this. Let's just slice the child in half.
Yeah.
And one of the women cries out, nope, she can have, and it's like, that's clearly the mom, because it's about the child's life, right? The court has entered pretty fully into that 50-50 sort of thing, which is psychologically tearing children apart. And it is my strong belief that children after a divorce should experience as close to the home life that they had before. They should experience that same life afterwards. So if they have a primary caregiver who very, very often is the mom, if they have somebody who is making the decisions for them and setting the appointments, that type of thing, there's no reason that doesn't continue. Unless you're up against a narcissistic abuser who is very angry that you saw through them, that you dared leave, that you dare expose them to the family court and who they are. And so they will fight to the death to make sure that they get their pound of flesh. It's really, really insane.
Wow.
We've even noticed that they would rather spend hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting, paying child support, than to pay tens of thousands of dollars in child support.
I was going to ask, how he pays child support at least for the child? Yeah. Okay, thank God. And when you say it's not, so full custody means he still sees the child at some point, maybe weekends or something.
That's the law.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the law.
I see.
The thing of it is that it's hard because I have to differentiate between my situation and my client's situation. Obviously, many of my clients have similar situations to my own. Many of them have something that is, it's funny because when I worked with Tina, she said it was the second worst case of abuse she'd ever seen in her life. And that really struck me. But now that I've, helped hundreds upon hundreds of women, I've seen stuff that I could not imagine living in. And so much strength. They're so incredibly strong that they're getting through this, but yeah.
I'm so glad you left after 2 years. Like, I am so, so glad. Because I don't know how, if you stayed longer with everything you described, it would have just been so horrible. So how long would you say it took you to recover from all of that abuse? Because
I think...
Did it impact your self-esteem, your self-worth, or anything?
Right.
And how did you...
Well, so here's the interesting... Yeah. Sorry to overlap. Here's the interesting thing is I was craving and searching for, and I was, finding help for psychological abuse and this, that, and the other thing. But I happened upon Melanie Tonya Evans, who is based in Australia, who had this program called the Narcissistic Abuse Recovery Program. And I didn't realize there was no such thing as narcissistic abuse, I thought at that time, right? Again, this is like 13 years ago. And so I ended up happening upon her, and I got on her email list, and she was speaking my language. Like, her emails were all my life. But she had a program. And at the time, I was all kind of, a program, what's a program going to do for me? Now I'm a great believer in programs. But at the time, I was, kind of like, I can't, plus I couldn't afford it. Like, he had emptied out my bank account. At the time, he was paying nothing, right? Christmas was nothing but a bunch of hand-me-downs, which worked out just fine, by the way, because people, were happy to donate things that were still in mint condition. But a few months went by where I felt like I just couldn't make headway on recovery. And finally, I just sucked it up and found the money to get into her program. And it completely changed my life. My best friend, after I was done going through her modules, and I want to say I was avoiding it because it sounded very quackadoodle to me. It's just like, what? How is this recovery? This sounds like mystical thinking and magical. And I was all kind of like, this doesn't make sense to me. But I became desperate, and I'm so glad that I just listened to myself instead of judging myself. I'm so glad, because I did her, wackadoodle program, and it changed my world. And after a couple months of it, my best friend said, can I say something to you? Because we've been best friends for decades here. You're back. Like, he turned you into a shadow of yourself. And when you left, you were still a shadow of yourself. And this program that I know you were fighting doing, I know you said you're done. And so this is my chance to say that almost a month in, I could see you coming back. And now I just want to tell you you're back. And it was just a jaw-dropping moment for me. And that's not just the end of it. It takes, I think, what we do with our clients is we tell them you need to find a good trauma therapist. And there are about half a dozen particular modes of trauma recovery we'd like to see them find a therapist who is certified or well-versed in. And of course, so I went through trauma therapy, and somewhere along the way, someone diagnosed me with CPTSD, complex PTSD. And that's really where my work began. So I would say that I'm finishing, we're coming on 10 years, 12, 13 years of recovery. I would say that I'm finishing up the last vestiges of stuff that I've carried with me since childhood that turned me into the type of person who didn't have really firm boundaries, and was able to be the type of person to be victimized, right? So, certainly I'm a survivor of that, and nobody deserves to be abused.
Nobody.
But I do think that when we would determine what part of ourselves abusers find attractive, if we're able to address that, if that is indeed a part of it, that can make such a huge difference, because I realized I was attracting abusive bosses, abusive friends, so it's like I clearly was trying to work something out. And, now along the way, I've had a lot of professionals who have worked with me at the top of their field, because I'm privileged enough to access that. That has made really huge difference.
That is awesome. So what you're saying is, it came from your childhood, for instance, maybe, right? Because
it did.
Growing up, maybe which of the parents was maybe more abusive now?
Yeah, it was definitely one of the parents. You also have to understand a Puerto Rican father and a Caucasian mother getting together when they did, they were considered, there was a term that was used quite a bit at the time, interracial marriage. And that's what they had. And so, I grew up being completely rejected by the white side of the family for, almost completely rejected with few exceptions for, having that, that brown father. And so it's kind of an incredible thing. I'm close with both parents. I, pretty much always have been. But yes, also I did have one of my parents who was particularly cluster B, we'll say. Yeah.
Wow, interesting. No, I took a lot from your story, because you mentioned something about boundaries, right? So I feel like when you grow up without boundaries, it's easy to attract those people, because narcissists don't like people with strong boundaries, because, it's easier to go to someone who has all their walls down and they're able to penetrate. I'm so sorry you went through all of this. This is so touching. Like you said, Mia's story was so touching, and I really enjoyed that discussion. And I'm so fascinated by this story, by this, because I feel like I've experienced it in some way, narcissistic abuse. When I hear all of your experiences, it helps me. It helps confirm what I experienced, because sometimes I'm like that. I'm like, was this? Oh yeah, that is it. So thank you, and I'm sure people listening will really identify with your story, and it'll probably give them some kind of relief and freedom. So what you do today, and I know we're running out of time. So what you do today is you work with DV lawyers, or you work with divorce lawyers. You come on alongside divorce lawyers as a DV consultant to help women fighting for custody for their children, right?
Sometimes we work with lawyers, but clients usually just come directly to us.
Okay.
So I am, a custody strategist, and I have developed programs now that I understand how much they
can you speak a little bit about it, just for someone out there that might be?
Yeah. So, Best Foot Forward Consulting has, so my methodology, the templates and that type of thing that I did end up expanding is called the Custody Blueprint. And So we have programs that we have. The program that is what I started with, the flagship program, is the Custody Blueprint program. And that's where we are working with a very small number of women at a time to help them to build their case. And that has a 90% success rate. So we are helping these moms to get the custody arrangement that they know is best for their children. Along the way, however, and we're doing it with case prep. Let me just very quickly say we're doing it with case prep. The Custody Blueprint has 3 pillars. Strategy, which pretty much everybody comes to us saying they don't have in spite of having a lawyer. Evidence, and mindset, because a lot of these moms are accidentally playing into the narrative, the false narrative, the lies that their ex is bringing into court against them. But obviously that's for people who have the means to be able to work with us in that way. So I spent a few years trying to design a way to get the Custody Blueprint to people who cannot afford to work with us at that higher level. And so we also have Pro Se Clinic. Pro Se Clinic is giving people access to that Custody Blueprint with trainings of how to do it on their own, but still having touch points with coaches so that they can make sure they're on the right track. And so I'm very pleased and proud that we were finally able to launch that about 6 months ago. So we have different ways of helping people, but our goal is to help the healthier parent to get the custody arrangement in court, to help the court see what's really going on in the right way that the court wants to see, so that they can protect their children and get the best custody arrangement that's possible in their jurisdiction for their kids.
Yeah, because it's the kids that suffer most in all of this, right? So I'm glad you're doing this type of work that helps them. So how can people reach you, and what do you charge? So is it better for someone fighting for custody to go through you or go through a divorce lawyer? Like what's the scenario there? How does the arrangement work?
Well, we always recommend that everybody have a lawyer, but
Okay.
not everybody can afford one. Unfortunately, the reason why is because if your ex has a lawyer and you don't, you only have a 20% chance of winning. That's what the stats show. So it's better to have a lawyer, which automatically brings it up to a 50% chance of winning. And then you add in what we do, and your chances skyrocket for getting the best custody arrangement you can. People can go to thecustodyblueprint.com, and there's a free masterclass there that might just be enough for a lot of parents. They're already in the middle of their battle. I mean, that's usually when people come to us, they're already in the middle of their battle. So they're finding us, and that free training right there really is set to help people look at their case, figure out how to change things, move things around, and better talk to their lawyer. And so that's really the place to start. And then if people feel like they want to do deeper work and get us in their corner, then at the end of that training, there's a way for them to book a call. For people who are pro se and they're really just struggling and they need to get started right away, then they can go to proseclinic.net, which is where pro se is, or they can go to thecustodyblueprint.com, which will also help them get to our Pro Se Clinic. But I recommend that people start with that free training, because that just might be all you need to sit down and figure out your case and improve it.
Okay, good, awesome. And I'm going to put all that information in the description box of the YouTube video and the show notes of the podcast. So Renee, if you don't mind sending me all of those, so I can just have all of those information. So do you service the whole United States and outside, or is it just limited to the East Coast where you are? How far do your services go?
So we're currently working in 5 countries at the moment.
Okay.
All of the United States, all of Canada, the UK, Australia, and Singapore.
So you're doing a wonderful job. I feel like turning your pain into gain for other people, right? Because like you said, your background is strategy and your first-hand experience in this thing, like you understand it more than anyone else. So who else can represent these women better than you? So fantastic. Yeah, thanks for the job you do. So what would be your advice to a mom, someone out there fighting, going through this hard time, trying to get away from that abusive ex and then get custody of their children and just come back to normalcy in their life? What would be your advice to them?
I think, the number one thing is to document everything. There's a bit of a trend that it's exhausting. So there's a trend I've noticed on the internet saying you don't have to document everything. And when we have clients who don't document everything, we really lose out. So I'm here to say, actually, yes, do document everything. And also build a team. If you're going into family court, you got to have a team. You got to have your lawyer, you got to have a therapist, you got to have a child therapist, you got to have a DV advocate who's coming to court, hopefully. And I'm always going to recommend that somebody get a custody strategist, like what we do, or at least a divorce coach, if not a custody strategist.
Awesome. Nice advice. So where can people find you? Your socials? What are you working on now? And do you have any last word for our listeners?
Yeah. So again, you can find me at thecustodyblueprint.com, and just make sure you use the word THE, thecustodyblueprint.com. But what we are working on now actually is I'm a specialist in preparing people for their custody evaluation. And so we are now launching a 4-week program to get people fully ready for that evaluation, because 85 to 90% of judges will go along with whatever the evaluator recommends. So people think you're supposed to convince the judge. You're supposed to convince the evaluator. So, and I think my final words definitely would have to be, it is not your fault. It is not your fault. Moms say, I brought my children into the world with this father. No. You brought your children into the world. It is not your fault that he turned out to be who he was. It is not your fault. It is not your fault.
You heard it all. It is not your fault. Like, just let that blame go off your shoulder, being conditioned that it's always your fault. It can be hard to get out of that mindset. But yeah, Reneé is saying it's not your fault. Let it go. Let it go. Awesome. Wow. Thank you so much, Reneé. I've had such a wonderful time talking to you. Thanks for sharing your story, for being vulnerable. I'm sure people will definitely, relate to this and, take something from it and get their lives back. So thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate your support. Thank you for always coming back. Please listen, like, comment, share, subscribe, leave us a review wherever you're listening from or watching on YouTube. We really appreciate your support and keep coming back for more interesting topics. Yeah, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you. Bye-bye.